Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Peg Brand Weiser, who is currently teaching philosophy at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon. Peg, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Delightful to be here.
Awesome. So we're talking about your book, Camus The Plague, Philosophical Perspectives, which came out earlier this year, 2023, from Oxford University Press. You edited this book, you wrote the final chapter of the book. And as I was telling you earlier, I really love this book. I read it a month or so ago. And yeah, top to bottom, you stacked it with, really good authors writing deep and insightful things about Camus' novel and how it relates to today. And so I guess, just to start off, I just want to invite you to just, talk about the book.
Well, thank you. And as we analyze, there's a lot of psychology here in these essays and the project itself. As we analyze the psychology, it's even interesting to me to wonder why 3.5 years after the start of a pandemic, now we find it interesting to still read about it or read these essays. How did you come to appreciate these differently than you would have if you would just read Camus as an undergrad? So there are so many ways to analyze the aesthetics of it, and as I've even spoken in the past about this, the applied aesthetics of this 1947 novel. So if you allow me to share my screen, I will let everybody see much more clearly than I can just describe. The cover of the book, I was very attentive to. This is part of the series in Oxford, edited by Richard Eldridge, in philosophy and literature. There are about 12 books. I believe there are 2 more forthcoming. James Joyce, Ibsen, and they are edited really by Richard Eldridge, who has written a lot about philosophy of literature, of course, and in aesthetics. So I submitted this proposal immediately, almost upon the start of the pandemic, which again is another kind of interesting side story, but I'll skip that for now. We can come back to that. And when I thought about a plague or a pandemic, we were calling it a pandemic in the spring. I can remember, everyone can remember in February when things shut down. I had just come back from a conference. There was no more travel for the next couple of years. Everyone was in shock. We were hearing words like lockdown, and teaching changed radically. We could not go into the classroom. And that changed over time as well in terms of geographic location, where you lived, what kind of campus you were at, private, public. So everything started snowballing, I'd say, in February, March of 2020. And I just immediately thought of Camus. And I had read this several times. I love the book. I love Camus' writings. I am fully aware that he does not call himself an existentialist. For those of us looking at the minutiae of his life and his friends, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and others in the existentialist circle in Paris. He was born in Algeria, spent the war years in Paris, part of the French resistance to the Nazis in World War II. And yet, I think what I remembered from the novel and brought me to it was the descriptions of the rats. And there's an essay here by Cynthia Freeland, who's written books on horror and natural evil in the plague. So chapter 6 is Cynthia's analysis of bats and rats, but his depiction of rats and stepping on a rat and squishing a rat, and the rats being nothing, a side thought for the main character, Dr. Roux, who's a physician. And then they appear more, and then they're all over the stairways, and then they're infiltrating buildings. and the streets, and they can't get rid of them. So the image to me in a fictional novel of rats invading my space stuck with me. And I also have to say that when I was first studying The Plague by Camus, I lived in Chicago, and I went to hear the Chicago Symphony Orchestra do the debut of a German work of music on The Plague. And it was earth-shattering to me, because the other question is, how do you translate fiction, rats, suffering, and death, arbitrary death, into music? And so the translation of that with the full chorus of Chicago Symphony on the stage, hundreds of singers, atonal, so much percussion, scratching of the strings on the piano to mimic the sound of the rats, nails on the ground. I guess I'm just haunted. I don't even like horror movies. I don't watch them because they're too much for me. But Camus' narrative and then the musical version of it made such an impression on me that it's really the first thing I went to when we started shutting down. So one reason I went to it was to see, well, what did he think about a plague when he made up the story? And so in my introduction, I talk about him, of course, and his publications and his upbringing and his philosophical thoughts, his writings on the absurd. If there's ever an example of the absurd, as one of the authors, Andrew Edgar, writes about in chapter 3, the meaning of a pandemic is you are facing absurdity. You can't explain it. It's totally irrational. You have no control. Now what do you do? And you're isolated. Now you're isolated. Because the little town of Oran, which is actually a town in Algeria, voluntarily shuts its gates and shuts down. So the citizens reluctantly shut down. And in the introduction, I talk about Camus' choice of this story, the reaction to it. Some of his fellow philosophers didn't like it and thought it was too moralistic, too idealistic, because in the end, I guess this is, spoiler alert, but he is idealistic and wants to emphasize that people are better and come to their better selves in the face of a pandemic. So the chapters deal with, there's a scholar, Camus scholar, in chapter 1, talking about the present moment, sort of situates us in the present moment. Chapter 2 is atypical, to focus on women in the writing of Camus. He has almost no role for women characters. And so Jane Schultz, who is in English literature and also medical humanities and teaches the history and writes about nursing and narrative medicine, had to come up with a way to talk about women in the narrative, but also to place women in our current pandemic of the role of nurses. How many nurses gave of themselves? This is the feminist ethics of care. Hours and hours, as did doctors and other staff people in hospitals and nursing homes. But the nurses totally not present in Camus, although he should have known better, she says, played such a role in our current pandemic. In chapter 4, Kathleen Higgins, who has written on grief and grieving, talks about the stages of grief, a very traditional approach, and also what happens in the plague and in our own pandemic. The fact that we never grieved publicly together under the Trump administration. Only the night before Biden was inaugurated into the presidency of the US did we have any public acknowledgement nationwide of the now 1.1+ million deaths in the United States. Chapter 5 is the narrative devolution of the physician in Camus. Albert Weiser is actually my spouse and a retired physician who writes about the role of the physician being undermined by a disease that has no cure. In fact, part of the anxiety, the tension in the novel is waiting for at least a type of vaccine and hoping it will work, and realizing that it doesn't necessarily work just because it's been created, with one of the most horrendous scenes in the novel of a young boy dying. In chapter 7, Margaret Gray, who's a French scholar, writes about the connection between the summer of 2020 and Black Lives Matter protests, with many protesters in masks protesting the death of George Floyd, and who could not breathe, was held down by the police and could not breathe. And the fact that actually with the plague, or even with COVID, there is a loss of breathing, and the connections between those two. And we'll get to talk about my chapter a little bit as well, about modern death and decent death and heroic solidarity in the plague, and where I think we are now. So if you will allow me, I'll read a little statement. It's a 500-word statement that will be published on the Oxford academic blog as to where we are now. And it's titled, Pandemic? What Pandemic? 3 months after the official US government end of 3 years of monitoring the COVID-19 pandemic that took over 1.1 million American lives, we are back to normal, I put in quotes. This is the summer of pink, Barbie, Taylor Swift, and the women's soccer team in the World Playoff. But divisive politics, as usual, are taking place in DC, Washington, DC, and 3 indictments of former President Donald J. Trump take center stage. Carefree citizens seem to have forgotten the past 3 years of contagion, contentiousness, suffering, and death. Our public health emergency, as it was called, has been replaced by a science of forgetfulness. The insistence to return to normal, or something relatively close to normal, is acute. This is both a symptom of pandemic fatigue and so-called existential relief at being alive, working from home, traveling abroad, and planning the future. And coincidentally, I say everything now seems to be labeled existential. Journalists, pundits, and politicians concur. Philosopher Albert Camus offered us a compelling narrative in 1947 that became a bestseller again in spring 2020 worldwide, as the world shut down its social activities to withdraw into isolation. As a pied noir, it's a French term, Camus was born a French citizen in Algeria, whose burden was to reconcile his 2 allegiances through philosophical insight. As a novelist, he set the plague in Oran, a rather lifeless, modern, he calls it, seaport, where people's daily routines were set by the sun and the seasons. Out of nowhere, rats invade. They bring horror, disease, and slow, painful, breathless death. We witness a predictable pattern of human behavior previously documented in real-world accounts of plagues from ancient Greece, the Justinian plague of 541 BC, 14th century Italy, Boccaccio on the Black Death, and Daniel Defoe, 17th century Great Plague of London, all of which played a role in his research on the plague. Camus' Plague invites rich comparison to COVID-19, the pattern of denial, anger, fear, hostility, then resignation in the face of the uncontrollable. He seeks to explain the absurdity of unprovoked death, arbitrary infliction, and human inevitability in facing a foe that takes on animalistic, indeed anthropomorphic qualities to slay the masses. Dr. Rue's mantra, "We all face death together," is the way he advocates fighting without a cure while awaiting a vaccine, while people turn on each other. We see it ourselves. Medical science argues with those who called the pandemic a hoax. Doctors, nurses, patients, and vulnerable populations antagonize anti-vaxxers. Dr. Rue calls for solidarity, what I call heroic solidarity, in order to rally the troops. On the metaphorical level, of course, he is recalling the French resistance to fighting Nazism during World War II. His novel is a remembrance and a memorial to freedom. Did we face the foe of COVID and fight together in heroic solidarity? Our behavior a confirmation of Camus' idealism? He said, what's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men rise above themselves. Or did we fail the challenge to unite, opting instead for selfishness, pettiness, and political weaponization of a virus that killed 7 million people worldwide? As Camus hauntingly foretells, the plague bacillus never dies. It waits below the surface and will rise again. Camus' 74-year-old daughter offered her thoughts in the March of 2020 when sales were surging. She said, perhaps with the lockdown, we will have some time to reflect about what is real, what is important, and become more human. I say we can surely tell ourselves that next time, after further study and reflection, we'll be more prepared, but will we?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. That was fantastic. And as you were reading that, I came up with like 4 or 5 more questions. So we'll see what we get to. But the place I wanted to start is something you mentioned near the end there, which is at the start of our pandemic, sales of Camus' novel, The Plague, skyrocketed. Right. It became an international bestseller after, 70 some years. And, that leads me to wonder about, at least for me, my response at the start of the pandemic was escape, right? I don't want to think about reality because it's too horrible, right? People are dying. It's terrifying. I have 2 small children. Yada, 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 right? We're now at home full time while I am trying to adjust to teaching to Zoom, right? It was just too damn much. And, so the entertainment I sought out was escapist, right? And whereas a lot of people had the exact opposite response, right? Not only did Camus' novel skyrocket in sales and people were clearly, engaging with it by the millions, but Steven Soderbergh's film Contagion, which is about a pandemic, was like a movie that people were watching again, right? And I just want to talk about like that difference in response to, the start of our pandemic, right? Of engaging with film, literature, art in general that reflects our reality and reflects the horrors of our reality back to us, versus those like myself at the time who are like, and I don't want to think about this, right? I know, I'm not denying that it exists, unlike, our president at the time, for example, and a lot of his followers. But, I recognize this reality, but I want to push that reality as far away from, my life as I possibly can. And so could you just talk through, why this novel became popular again?
Yes. And I think you're capturing a wide range of reactions. And of course, one could want to escape at one time, and especially after Zooming for 3 hours with your classes, I want to say, oh my gosh, give me something else mindless to do, but then vacillate back, and lots of terrain in between. And it would depend on one's social situation. Parents who are now stuck at home with no daycare and no babysitters, and no grandparents even nearby to help with childcare, presents a whole different kind of challenge as well. So I think that one answer to it is to ask oneself, where am I in the spectrum of aesthetic experiences? I may love music, I may love opera, I may love live concerts, Taylor Swift, your area of expertise. My God, she's causing earthquakes.
I know, right?
In Seattle, just north of me. And I'm thinking, and it will be this billionaire, if not already, giving away $100,000 to her truck drivers and all of our other staff as well. So we have preferences for what we do with our time and our free time, of which we ended up with more. We ended up isolating with more free time. We're not commuting, we're not seeing friends, we're not going to restaurants, and we're stuck. And people danced online, Instagram, whatever. People were dancing, they were singing, they were recording things. Social media just went crazy, I think. Skype, sounding old-fashioned, gets replaced by Zoom, and we're all becoming very technically forced to become technically engaged in all of these mediums. But I went back to the novel, and I think it's because, as I said, I was so struck by it, my previous encounters with it and the musical version of it. And also images of mourning. Kathy Kollwitz is one of the artists that I illustrated in regard to Kathleen Higgins' essay on grief, The Grieving Mother. And I think art, for me, because I was trained as an artist before a philosopher, is the way I think about handling a challenge. So yes, I could have escaped into art, but it is. In fact, in the intro, I talked that this could be considered escapist fiction. I'd rather read about the rats in fictional Oran in 1940 versus my own pandemic. Okay, but it didn't really make you feel a lot better, maybe, until you got the message of solidarity, which ekes through towards the end. And then, of course, some critics would say, well, he's so idealistic. That's so unrealistic. You know, shame on Camus, Nobel Prize winner. Anyway, so as an artist who is also very inspired by Simone de Beauvoir, who also wrote, like Camus, through World War II, was part of the French Resistance. And at the end of it, and I've written essays about her aesthetics, she says it's the job of the artist, in her mind, to confront the truth, not to escape from it. In fact, she derides what she calls salon haunters, the aesthetes who hang out in the salons, the Italians, the French who hang out in salons, talking about beauty and pleasure and idyllic narratives and stories. She says, we just went through World War II, and as Camus says, the evil incarnate of wiping out masses of people. Uncalled for, unexpected, perhaps, if you're political science, probably not scientist, but arbitrary almost, vicious, cruel killing of people, embodied in the rats in this novel. But Beauvoir says, you don't have the luxury of escaping. You don't have the luxury. Her novel, The Mandarins, is about what do you do after the war? Do you become a communist? But hey, bad things are happening in Russia too. Oh no, we don't see that. We're going to be communists. We're all about socialism. And she says, I don't know. She writes The Ethics of Ambiguity. Oh my gosh. I teach now a course on pandemic aesthetics. And you can't do that without teaching the ethics of ambiguity, in which Beauvoir says there are certain people in the world who are subhuman. If Camus' daughter calls for us to be more human, Beauvoir watched during World War II the subhumanity of killing another person for no reason other than difference. So the urgency with which she and Hannah Arendt and other, of course, lots of writers, even now, throughout all of history of literature, music, art, have talked about the horrors of the evil of persons. For her, it's a luxury to escape that. And especially as an artist has the duty to write about that and to confront the truth, no matter how unpleasant. The Holocaust. So she writes, what is it to confront that evil? For Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. So these are such deep questions. And I think Camus, in turning this novel into a tribute, a memorial, as he says at the end, this is Dr. Rue, who is revealed at the end as the narrator, had to write this as a tribute to these people that we lost. And one of the artworks I also put in is an artist, American artist, who on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. put up 600,000 white flags to commemorate then the number of dead. And they made videos of her. They talked to her. People came. People visited flags with the names of these people on. They wrote on the flags. It was interactive. And she said, I had to do something to remember. We're now at 1.1 with a surge. I have to tell you, I just went on the WHO World Health Organization site this morning. We are in a surge of COVID right now. It's not over. And so there is no escaping. We can escape for pleasure, distraction, and be our aesthetic can become anti-pandemic, but we are living in this world in which we are all continuing to suffer the effects. I record headlines now. I used to record the number of dead every day, but that got shut down this spring, as we know, by Johns Hopkins stopping that count. But the WHO is still keeping count. And what's happened is that we're living in the politicization now, the lingering, ongoing, dangerous, deadly politicization of COVID-19, in which at the beginning, Black populations, African-American and indigenous populations have lost 6.5 years in their life expectancy. It dropped from 71.8 years in 2019 to 65.2 by the end of 2021. And that's 2 years ago already. So indigenous populations, vulnerable populations were most at risk, but guess what? Because of the politicization of COVID, now it's white populations who are dying more in Republican counties, and Republicans are dying what we now call excess deaths, unnecessary deaths because they refuse to get vaccinated or take measures. And
mask, social distance, et cetera. Yeah.
And as I shared with you before we started recording, in the state of Florida, Governor DeSantis signed measures in the name of medical freedom for his state citizens that include bans on mask and vaccine mandates. So if the resurgence becomes even more deadly, more dangerous, and it's still the third leading cause of death in the country, especially with seniors. Seniors are in dire straits as well. Then we have states enacting laws that will prohibit preventative measures. So the absurd surfaces in ways that no one could have predicted for us. I don't know about Camus. I think Camus probably saw and heard things during the war that again forced him to confront that absurdity of evil. What do I do in the face of that?
Yeah, fantastic. And so on precisely that topic, and this segues really nicely to our discussion of your chapter. you know, Camus is commemorating, with the novel metaphorically, those who gave their lives for the French resistance and, all of those who are resisting Nazis, right? And so there are people, who bravely, heroically align themselves against Nazism in France. However, there was a large part of the French population that got buddy with the Nazis, right? Who aligned themselves with the Nazis. And so if you take the book at the metaphorical level of the Nazis are metaphorically the disease in the novel, you have those who align themselves with Nazis align themselves with the disease, right? Versus those who, align themselves with the resistance are, pushing against and trying to prevent and to stop and to thwart the Nazi slash disease, right? And in your chapter, you make this distinction between heroic solidarity and unheroic solidarity, right? And this notion of heroic solidarity, right, is those who have joined together to combat the disease, or at the metaphorical level, combat the Nazis, right? But to put that onto our contemporary reality, right, to to put freedom, right, individual freedom, right, in the libertarian sense, right, ahead of collective well-being at sort of the analysis that Camus is giving us, or that we can glean from the novel, right? What people are doing essentially is aligning themselves with the virus. It's almost as if they want the virus to succeed, in the way that during World War II, some French people were doing well off under the Nazi occupation. And so we're going to align ourselves with the Nazis, or, the criminal in The Plague, right, who's able to make money off of the virus, in a sense, wants the virus to succeed. And so could you talk about that distinction between heroic versus unheroic solidarity and, all that stuff I just said?
Very, very well put. Good question. It's not a coincidence that Camus calls people heroes. In fact, it is a rather, in some cases, an ironic sense of heroism, because he says, well, the soft-spoken guy who just keeps recording the number of dead is the hero. And you think, well, what does that make of a hero in the novel? But for him, fighting the foe, fighting the good fight, means fighting together with other men. It's generally all men in the novel, and doing something. This is also like Beauvoir and lots of existentialist theorizing. You do something in the face of a challenge. You do something. You don't just sit there. You don't just talk about it. You don't succumb. He's very much against suicide. How do you face the absurd? You do not commit suicide. You face it. And so the hero can even be the person who's trying to bury the dead. They end up with mass graves. Another visual image that's just so horrendous. But we've seen them in, Germany. So we don't have to imagine everything in a fictional novel. We've also have haunting images of those things. So the hero does the work with very little reward, often unsung. And lo and behold, during the pandemic, we are cheering the heroes, the nurses, the doctors, the people transporting corpses into trucks in New York City because they got hit so bad at the beginning. We're banging on pots. I mean, really, really kind of unbelievable. What? That's our expression. We're banging on pots at a certain time of day. That's all we could do for these people. Maybe give them a raise, maybe give them time off, maybe recruit more people into nursing. I don't know, more doctors. Anyway, it's a whole nother issue. But we had our heroes, and even that becomes divisive, right? The anti-vaxxer, anti-mask derides this notion of heroism. And so they align themselves. That's what I call the unheroic solidarity. Many of the authors in this volume make no bones about it. We're talking about Donald J. Trump, who is president, and calling it a hoax. It's going to be gone by April. It's under report. They're making a big deal out of it in the press. The press hates me. I'm the victim. And I write about, in my essay, I ask people to imagine what would happen. I think one of the most crucial turning points was Trump getting COVID, spreading it to all kinds of people as well as the White House. But when he gets it and is flown by helicopter to Walter Reed and is apparently given every drug available, which he then comes back and lies to the human audience in America saying, you too can get all these drugs I just got at Walter Reed, no problem. I asked the question, the hypothetical, as a philosopher, I can ask a hypothetical, what would have happened if he had died? If he had died, there would be no hoax rhetoric anymore. There would have been, holy shit, the president of the United States just died of COVID, who told us to inject bleach, by the way, or the horse medicine I give my horses, you know, and he's gone. So maybe he's not right. And then that led me to think, well, what is this thinking? People now call it a cult. There's a cult. What is this cultish thinking that brings people to the unheroic solidarity with Trump and Republican leaders? It's not just him, who supported him and caused rifts in state legislatures and universities. You know, I was at a university that wouldn't mandate vaccine. I got that out of that state as soon as I could. I don't want to live in a state where my governor says, nah, you don't have to get a vaccine. So now I'm going to class with all the students who are not vaccinated. I'd rather be at a university where they were forced, mandated, at least as best as possible, to be vaccinated. So where you live matters now, and the way you align politically matters in terms of your longevity, your health, your affiliations. We now have this incredible separation in the country. And I'm jumping ahead maybe with your question about where do we go from here with such divisiveness, where the libertarian says, well, it's still my body, you can't tell me. Which often is the same libertarian who says, I will legislate what females can do with their bodies. Yeah, so much for, they don't take logic or
consistency is irrelevant.
Consistency's out the window with, So we have this situation where we have this split. It's not going away. It's intensifying with 3 indictments, possibly 4. And spreading through state legislatures and universities and curricula. We can't teach certain things anymore in our curricula. And it's as if we have individualism, libertarianism gone rampant. And Camus says, well, even in the face of the most horrendous evil of Nazism or a plague or whatever, men will rise. I believe they will rise to their better selves and think about the communal good. So what I conclude in my essay, reluctantly, is that we are at a fragile, tenuous, heroic solidarity. And no one knows where we're going to go from there. Some people said, horrible, it took 2.5 years for DOJ to come up with indictments. Other people say, thank goodness, after 2.5 years, we have indictments, and 1,000 people have been brought to justice from January 6th. So it's so impossible to separate all of these things because they were clearly, intentionally, by the Trump administration mixed together. And I talk about what social psychologists are saying and what's my other term? existential neuroscientists are saying. Who ever heard of that term? Which actually, both articles I cite in my essay predate the pandemic. Social scientists say if you are a somewhat timid person lacking self-confidence, you will gravitate towards a leader who might be a billionaire, not like you, but you will gravitate towards a strong, rock hard, opinionated, bossy, bullying leader who lifts your spirits, with whom you feel solidarity. And I thought, well, that seems to be what has happened. But I see it as an unheroic, because it is undermining it at first, until that turning point with Trump, the vaccine, right? Until he got it, there wasn't a lot of recommendations for the vaccine. We are, by the way, worldwide at, oh my gosh, 13.5 billion vaccines, distributed unevenly across the globe, of course. So social psychologists are saying conditions were ripe. Trump did get elected. He already had a following. He had a base that felt he was satisfying a certain psychological need for them and making them part of a group. You put on a MAGA hat, you are part of a group. You go out there and hold your flag, you're part of a group. And that's a good feeling. The neuroscientists are saying, in addition, I think, to that kind of explanation of human behavior that we're witnessing, is that we think of ourselves and others, but self will always come first. Self is coming first, unless maybe you block it or avert that obsession with yourself. And threatened with death, I asked the question that Bob Solomon asked in a great essay on Camus, the late Bob Solomon, Robert Solomon. Did we face death together? Bob Solomon said, in Camus, they faced death together. I looked around me and said, I don't think we're facing death together. Some are in denial. Some people died in hospitals, totally wrapped up on oxygen, no family members allowed, a nurse with a cell phone saying they do not have COVID. And when you're dealing with a cognitive process in which a person dying of COVID says, I do not have COVID, to align with a group or to deny death, what they're saying is the existential threat of death is for someone else. So the anxiety is about death for someone else, but not me. It's not going to happen to me. So there are these incredibly rich theories. I also tap into Dr. Warwick's book on modern death, because he uses the same phrase that Camus did in 1947. Warwick wrote a few years ago, we're so technologically advanced. Everybody dies either in hospice, a dignified, decent death at the end of their days. Well, truth be told, most people, even religious believers going to Jesus, will stay in a hospital, shun hospice, and ask for every single possible life-saving medicine or device or measure to keep them alive. And my theory is that we're way past that notion of modern death. We were at the point where people were dying alone, with no vaccine, no medication, no family, as if it was the Black Death in Italy in the 14th century. And that's not modern. You could play a lot with the word modern, as I do, but and I think that's what Camus was doing. He was saying, oh, we're so modern in 1947. Rats come in and they just eat everybody. That's it. How modern is that? What does modern mean?
Yeah, right. And, that's reflected in the novel as well, where so many of those who get sick are just sort of shipped off to isolation, essentially, and they die alone. And, you know, you talk about in your chapter the few instances in the novel where people don't die alone, right? And that relates to, you know, this notion, you know, in the title of your chapter of what it is to have a decent death, right? What Camus seems to be saying is that a decent death is a death where you are not alone, right? Where you are surrounded by people who care for you. And that relates to the topic of ethics of care that you touch on. And you mentioned earlier, right? You touch on in the chapter, right? That the heroes of the novel, all of whom are men, adopt the ethics of care, which is a feminist notion, right?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting for a novel where the women characters are all on the periphery, right?
Yes. And of course, that concept, feminist ethics of care, of course, comes after, decades after Camus. We lose Camus. So what does that tell us? That feminists captured, we now have Yuriko Saito's book, Aesthetics of Care. I'm about to write about the aesthetics of care, and I'm thinking, is that new? Well, the ethics of care, I am married to a physician, isn't new. Physicians care for people. It's when they can't care, or you're facing, I've also taught classes on death and dying, and choice. I'm in the state of Oregon, which was the first to pass a law to allow ones to choose to die if death is pending in the next 6 months. Assisted suicide, as it was once called. And so facing that is daunting. And yet doctors do it all the time. Nurses do it all the time. Caretakers, people I mean, the stories we used to hear about the nursing homes, which now lack staff. Nurses quit, doctors quit, nursing home staffs quit, caregivers, day caregivers quit, teachers quit. Teachers are quitting. Teachers don't want to teach in the classroom anymore. So we have caregivers retreating, I think, in a way that is threatening to our lifestyle. I just moved back to Oregon a year or so ago. I couldn't find a doctor. I could not find a doctor. Wait lists. No, we're not even keeping wait lists. You know, just a general practitioner. Nope. So doctors are in scarce supply. Nursing. So I think we are now, and our younger generations, in which I have great hope, are facing decisions. They're all connected by social media. They all know what everybody's doing. They're all aware of what's going on. And this so-called science of forgetfulness, though, is duping us into thinking it's all over. You know, go to Europe this summer. Go to the Grand Canyon. All the parks are overrun with tourists. You can't even get a reservation for a camping spot. So we're all liberated. We're back to normal. But this threat, again, the power of language that Camus uses about the plague is in the folds of a blanket in your, you know, blanket chest, just waiting to come out. And I think young people who are much more attuned about the environmental issues, climate, voting, depriving women of the rights to autonomy of your body, decision-making, LGBTQIA+ issues, music. You know, music is supposedly healing us this summer, bringing us together. And it's a respite, it's an escape, right? But I don't think, but you know, musicians are being hit with objects on the stage. Why is that? Oh, it's post-pandemic. We had all these things bottled up in us, and now we have to throw them at the performer. That's not a good explanation. We need to figure this out. We're throwing things at our performers that we just paid money to see. So if you can't control that hostility, and you want to march on the Capitol, and you want to tear down flags, and you want to infringe on my health by telling me, you won't wear a mask, fine, but you won't make anyone else wear a mask because you're the governor of Florida, then we have problems in terms of going forward. I'm not sure I answered that question.
Oh, I think you did. I think we'll end it on that note. So Peg, thank you so much for joining me. The book, once again, is Camus The Plague, Philosophical Perspectives, Oxford University Press 2023. I couldn't recommend it more highly. It's a really terrific book. You and your contributors did an absolutely fantastic job. So Peg, thanks for the book, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. A great pleasure.